Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at the refresh token and how it can be used to retrieve new access tokens, which was the last episode of the arc of auth, where I would explain how the internal parts, like the API, client, and server, communicate to retrieve the token, to access authorized resources, and to refresh this access token. In this episode, we're going to start looking into IdentityServer, and in the coming episodes, we're going to expand more and more on what IdentityServer is and what it can provide. But in this episode, we're going to focus on the client credential flow and really just focusing on what IdentityServer is. As many things, it is just a toolbox, a collection of tools. So let's go ahead and create a new folder where we're going to place our project. So I'm going to call this IdentityServer4. And here I want to add a new project. This project is going to be the identity server and is going to be fulfilling the same role as the server in our auth arc. So essentially, this is what's going to be dealing out tokens and validating them, right? So let's go ahead and call this IdentityServer4. Sorry, we'll just call it identity server. And let's just make this empty. We'll start from scratch as always. So the first thing that I would like to do is go into startup and remove all these comments. I will map the default controller route, and I will also set up the controllers with views because we're going to have views later on in the tutorial, but not now. And another thing I want to do is, actually I'm not adding authentication. What I want to do is I want to just straight up go and get the toolbox that is IdentityServer, right? So let's go ahead and type in IdentityServer. Once it's loaded, just grab IdentityServer4 and install that. Okay, so once you got the package, what you can do is you can go to app and type in use IdentityServer, and that should be it for our middleware. Now, in our services, we want to go ahead and add not but IdentityServer, and this will inside of it, this will include authentication and authorization. Okay, and IdentityServer, again, I'm going to repeat this multiple times throughout the tutorials to really beat it into your head, but it is just a toolbox. It allows us to set up the infrastructure. It provides us with infrastructure to set up OpenID Connect flows. And what OpenID Connect is, we'll get into it later. But for now, just know that IdentityServer is something similar to Identity here. The way it provides us with infrastructure for setting users up and authenticating users and signing users out and roles and claims, etc. The way the identity provides us with infrastructure for that, IdentityServer provides us with infrastructure for auth and OpenID Connect, right? So with identity, our infrastructure are users, claims, and roles. With auth and OpenID Connect, our infrastructure is clients, APIs, and scopes, and other stuff that we're going to get into. And I'm going to explain what these parts of the flows are as we go through them. So the first thing that we're going to have is a client and an API. So this is what we'll need to do. And the way you register your client with IdentityServer, you can do it through a database, which we'll get to. But same as when you have entity framework and you add a database, you can have an in-memory database. So this is what we're going to do, is we're going to add in-memory API resources. So these are going to be our APIs. And we're going to add in-memory clients. And these are going to be our clients. And another thing we're just going to add here is add default developer signing credentials, and all this is going to do is just generate a certificate for signing the token. So you know how we had the secret key to sign our tokens? This is what it's going to do. This is going to generate a developer certificate to sign our tokens and create that signature. So in-memory API resources, we need to provide a list of resources, and for clients we need to provide a list of clients. And really what we are trying to set up is this communication where our client in the startup, where we have this add auth, We want to set up like stuff like client secret. So our server, before the client starts to exist, our server already needs to be aware of what the client is. Otherwise, it will be a security breach, and we don't want to be dealing out a token to a client that we don't know nothing about, right? So this is the sort of information that's going to be going into these. This is just like to identify what are our APIs that we're securing, and what are our clients that we're going to be dealing the tokens out to, right? So these are the main abstractions that Identity Server deals with, right? And here we can see the objects that it accepts. So API resource, and in here will be the client object, and then there in the IdentityServer4 .models namespace, right? So we're going to go ahead and create a static list of, a static class where we're just going to basically hold the values for these, and it's going to be something similar to these constants here. Okay, and later on we'll transfer them into the database. So let's go ahead and create a configuration class, and this is going to be a static class. And in here we want to create a IEnumerable API resource, right? So again, this is just going to be our API, and this is how this object is how IdentityServer4 chooses to sort of let you identify your API. Okay, so we're just gonna call get APIs because this is what it's going to return, and we're gonna return a new list of API resources. And in here we can go ahead and create a new API resource. And all we'll need to do is sort of provide an identifier, right? So we can have a bunch of name here, like scopes and secrets as well, but we will get to this part later on. At the moment, we're just trying to get the bare bones set up. So in here, we're just going to specify the name of API1. And what is it crying about? All right, we're in the static class, so this has to be static as well. Okay, so at this point, let me actually drop this to a new line because I think that will read a little bit easier. At the moment, we're basically registering one API that we're expecting to have a name of API1. So now we need a client that can consume this API. Okay, so let's go and say public static IEnumerable client get clients. Okay, and this is going to be a new list of client. And let's create a new client in here. And this will be slightly different. So what's this? Okay. So the first thing that we'll need to specify for a client is this stuff that we never really got to use, is the client ID and client secret. So let's go ahead and set these up. So in our configuration, let's grab the client ID, and I'm just going to set it to client ID. Next thing will be the client secret, and it's a multiple, so we will need to create a new secret. Like this. Okay, and we'll need to provide a value here. So we'll just say client secret and 2 SHA-256. And again, this is just another method, or I guess extension function that IdentityServer provides. And this is the algorithm that we're going to be using, and this is the secret, and this is sort of the string, right? Again, in production you'd have something a little bit more secure, but for now this will do. And this is how we would, this will be like one of the secrets of our clients, okay? And these can be set to expire, etc. We'll not get into that. We're not diving too deep. So we have our client. Now we basically have to say, how is it going to retrieve the access token? And by that, we will have to specify the grant, all right? So if we go into auth, this grant type, flow of access token request, right? So the way we're getting this access token is what we're trying to specify. So let's type in allowed grant types, and this is what we're going to choose, right? And then here we're going to say grant types, and again, this is just something that IdentityServer provides, just a list of flows that you can use, right? And the one that we're interested in is this client credentials flow. It looks like it's already an iCollection, and this is an iCollection. So we can just go ahead and say client credential flow here, and this should be good. All right, so we can retrieve, this is the way we're going to retrieve the access token, and this is the way that basically this information is then needed to make sure we know that this is the client that is trying to request the access token in this way. So now what we want to specify is the scopes that this client is allowed to get. So when I say scopes, or what it means here by scopes, is essentially what can this access token be used for. Okay, so let's go ahead and just say allowed scopes, and we will say API 1, and because there can be multiple APIs and we can specify multiple scopes, we can essentially set this to a string array, and there can be multiple APIs, so you can put multiple things in here, okay? But for now, we're basically saying that this client can access this API, this is how we're getting the access token, and this is the information needed to identify this client that is going to be getting it, to basically to even allow to get it this way, okay? So now let's go ahead and populate our information here. So I'm just going to go ahead, bring up the configuration class. I'm going to get the APIs, and I'm going to get the clients. Okay, and first thing that I want to do is actually, let's go ahead and change, or I don't need to go here yet. I just want to launch the identity server, and I want to show you a endpoint, which is going to be quite important in understanding how this whole thing is going to work. And this is going to be the .well-known OpenID configuration. Okay, and I'm pretty surprised I actually got that first try. Okay, so what this endpoint return, and again, the key is sort of in the name, it's .well-known OpenID configuration. This is something that's specified by the OpenID configuration spec. Same thing, the same way that auth was specifying things, and if you follow the document, you achieve this amazing flow. If you follow the OpenID spec, you're gonna end up implementing this endpoint, which is gonna return this information. And what this information essentially is, if I go into network and refresh here, this will be a little bit easier to see. What this essentially is if you look here, authorization endpoint, we're probably going to see the token endpoint down here, yep, and a bunch of other endpoints, right? So there's quite a bit more endpoints than auth. That's because OpenID Connect is an extension on top of it, and IdentityServer is an OpenID Connect implementation, right? Which is essentially auth included, but more, okay? And we're going to explore a bit more what OpenID does for you. But for now, all you need to know is that this endpoint is what other applications are going to attempt to read in order to know how to communicate with our identity server. And the .NET Core middlewares like add the JWT token and add OpenID client, they already know how to basically discover this endpoint and read the information, register it, and automate other processes to communicate with these endpoints specified here. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. Enough talking about that. Let's go ahead and create another project, and we're gonna call this an API, right? So we're gonna be creating an API, and I'm just gonna call this API 1. And I'm gonna create an empty project. And let's go to the startup. And let's just clear this up a little bit. And what I want to do is I just want to map controller route. There's going to be no views, so add controllers. And what I want to do is I want to use authentication and use authorization as well. Okay, so the strategy that we're going to be using here is map controller route. I have misspelled this, so map controllers. Yeah, map controllers, not controller route. Okay, so the strategy that we're going to be using here is the strategy that I've used in the server project, which was add JWT Bear. The reason we didn't use it in our API project before is I'm going to show you now. So add authentication, and then we're going to add JWT Bear, and obviously we're not going to have the reference. So let's go ahead and manage NuGet packages. We're going to browse for add JWT Bear, and we're going to find this JWT Bear package. Let's install that. Okay, so let's go ahead and name this bearer just so we can link it to our authentication, and let's specify some configuration. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to point your attention to the metadata address, okay? And this property, essentially, what it says on the tin, gets or sets the discovery endpoint for obtaining metadata, and that well-known OpenID configuration route is essentially the default route here, and this is how it's going to try to obtain the data, okay? And you would override this if you'd wanted to point to a different address, or you can flat out just set your own OpenID configuration, right? So you'd otherwise set this property. So essentially, the reason we couldn't do it before is because JWT Bear is designed to work with OpenID Connect, and for my simple example, I didn't want to set up an OpenID Connect flow and to support that discovery document, etc., just to explain it. So in our startup, we opted in for the default mechanism that auth didn't specify, but the OpenID Connect spec does specify how this communication and validation of the token happens. So now this can be concreted into an implementation and then abstracted away, which is what IdentityServer is, essentially that abstraction. Okay, so not drifting off too much, what we're trying to do is we're essentially trying to tell our API where to basically pass access tokens to validate them, right? So config authority, let's go ahead and grab the URL from our identity server. So alt enter to enter properties, debug section, and this protected URL here. Let's go ahead and set it here, right? So at this point, it pretty much knows where to pass it. Another thing we need to set is the audience, and we're just going to set it to API1, which is going to be this name here. So we're basically just identifying what resources trying to pass this token for authentication. Okay, so it's not just some random thing trying to validate a token. It's this API that we know about that is trying to validate this token, right? So at this point, the API has information of how to connect to the identity server and pass the token. All that information will be discovered from that discovery document, and then it will essentially know how to forward it and where to send the token, and it has the information about the token endpoint. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a controllers folder with a secret controller.cs, and let's go ahead and let's first inherit from controller. Okay, let's create a public action result index, and I'm just gonna actually return a string here, and what I will return is let's say secret message from API1. Okay, so I just want to return something super simple. Let's put a route here. So okay, so what I'm gonna try to hit /secret. I'm gonna hit this endpoint, and I'm just gonna receive this message, right? So super simple. I will also go ahead and authorize this. So I will be actually checking for an access token. All right, so that's done. Our setup for API1 is complete. Let's go ahead and collapse that. Now what we need is a client, since in our configuration we have set up an API and a client. At the moment, we have created the API. Now I want to create the client. And if you will notice in our identity server, we'll now have temp key.rsa, and this is created by the add developer signing credentials extension here. This is essentially what creates this temp key RSA, and this is what's used to sign your tokens. Okay, so coming back to it, let's go ahead and create the client. I'm going to go ahead and close everything except the configuration so I can look at it when I'm going to create my client. I'm going to right click, add a new project, and I am going to create API 2. Okay. So the point I'm going to try to make here is that an API can also be a client. Even if you name it an API, if it still tries to make a call to a different API using an access token, because an API can still request stuff from other APIs, right? And at that point, it's a client. Okay, so an API can be an API and a client. And a client can be an API as well, all right, as we will see from this example. Okay, so the following thing that we want to do here is I will actually go ahead, copy the stuff in the startup, since it's going to be pretty much identical because this is still an API, and we will create this second API later on in the tutorial, and we'll just name this API 2. We're going to go ahead into the CS project, and we're going to copy this part where we have the JWT Bear reference, okay? And we're going to go into API 2 and put it in here as well, so we have the package for this add JWT Bear extension, right? So we have set up the authentication here. What I will want to do now is add an HTTP client to be able to request a token, and then to use that HTTP client to call the API 1. Okay, so services, add HTTP client. Let's go ahead and add this bad boy. All right, there he is. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this. We have the HTTP client. We will be interested in this information during the scope of API 2, where it is being a client. All right, so let's go ahead and create a controllers folder, and let's create a home controller.cs. And we'll inherit from controller. As always, we will create a constructor where we will inject IHTTP client factory. Okay, let's name HTTP client factory. Let's create a field. And if only it ever named it correctly. Okay, so we have the HTTP client factory. Now what I want to do is I want to create a action result, and this will need to be async really, and task. Okay, inherit that, and let's just call this index, right? Because this is where we're going to be doing our stuff. So, and let's return OK, and we'll just return an object here at the end with our stuff. Okay, so primarily here, I'm not going to be authorizing on this API. I'm just basically making a point that this API can also be a client, and later on we'll use it as an API as well. First thing that we want to do is retrieve access token, and then retrieve secret data. So these are the two primary things that we want to do. So let's go ahead and create a client for the first one. So let's call this server client, and we're going to grab the HTTP client factory, create client. Okay, now before we get into actually getting the access token, what we'll need is we will need to add a package, which is going to be IdentityModel. So manage NuGet packages, IdentityModel, and it's this OpenID Connect and Auth client library. Let's go ahead and install this. Again, this is from the same guys that are working on IdentityServer4 project. What that package gives us are now a couple of extension methods that we can use on this client. Such methods as getting the discovery document. Okay, so we're going to grab discovery document, server client, and I cannot spell it, it's a really long name, but we're going to go into identity model and the client. Okay, and now get discovery document async. There it is. And we're gonna wait on this. And what we'll need to do is pass the address to this endpoint, right? So we're not configuring it anywhere in our startup. We will have to pass it to here. Okay. So let's go ahead into our startup and we'll grab this authority here. And we will just pass the same address here. All right, so at this point, we're going to have the discovery document, which is that well-known endpoint, which is going to contain all the information that we'll need about our identity server, right? So once we know everything we need to know about our identity server, the way it's configured, okay, so the next thing we need to do is to request our access token. So let's go ahead and grab our server client and we'll say request client credentials token async. So this kind of includes the flow that we're using in the name. And then we're going to pass the information of the connection in this object here. So let's go ahead and call this and then create this request. Okay. And we can await on this. And what this will return is a token response type. So let's go ahead and store the token response. And the token response is really what we have on the token endpoint here. The way we have returned this response object, that's what the token response is going to be. So let me drop this down here so it's easier to see. So the primary things that we want to specify is the address, which is going to be the token endpoint, which is what we're going to grab from the address. Next thing is we want to specify is the client ID, which we conveniently named client ID, and client secret, which is again just going to be client secret. And again, the client doesn't know anything about how to sort of hash this secret. You just need the secret, okay? So it doesn't know anything about creating the signature. So we have the client ID, we have the client secret. We will also need to provide the scope that we're requesting, all right? So in here, we'll need to say the scope, and again, say API 1. So we got the token response. What this will contain is, if I can go here, this will contain the access token, identity token, token type. Well, it's not going to contain an identity token, but it will have the access token and token type, which is going to be bearer, and etc. So we're really interested in the access token, which we're going to have at this point. So we have fulfilled our retrieval of the access token. Now we want to grab the secret data. Okay, so let's create a different client for it. So let's create an API client. And we're going to create a new client. And now for our API client, also conveniently, we can set bearer token. All right, so this is again something that comes from the IdentityModel package. And all we need to do is supply our bearer token, which is going to be from our token response. We can grab the access token and done. Okay, so now we can go ahead, grab the API client called getAsync. And again, I'm just going to quickly grab the URL from my API 1. So Alt Enter, again debug. I'm going to copy this URL and I'm going to paste it in here and /secret. I'm going to wait on it and var response. I'm going to grab the response. And now I want to grab the content. So response /content read a string async. Okay. And let's await on this. And now we can go ahead and return this as well. And we're of course going to take a look at it. So token response, access token, we can say access token equals this. And then we can say message equals content. Okay. Let's put a breakpoint here. Again, let's go into the solutions. Let's say Alt Enter here. And let's start multiple projects. We're going to start API 1, API 2, and IdentityServer. Remember that at this point, all we're learning about is the kind of tools and how IdentityServer abstracts the flows and the auth and OpenID Connect spec. We're going to learn a little bit more about OpenID later on. So just understand that Identity Server are the set of tools, and we're just gonna try to cover as much ground as possible in these series. Okay, so let's go ahead and start up these projects. So API 1 is the API in this scenario. API 2 is going to play the client, and the Identity Server is the server that deals out the tokens, right? So what is this? Go away. All right, so where are we? Which one is the real API, right? So let me add a route to this. So let's say route, and I'll just say slash, just so as soon as the browser starts up, it's gonna land on it and it's gonna go into this method straight away. Okay, so this one is still loading, so that's the one. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and take a look at the discovery document first. So this is a C# object representation of the JSON document that you have seen, right? So here you will see these endpoints being populated, whatever other data that is basically populated there. There is a raw representation here, right? So we can see this JSON object here as well. Right, all good. So this is that document being retrieved, and this is usually how it would be retrieved in the middleware as well. When the access token is sent to API 1, the way it retrieves this token is the same way. This discovery document is the same way. So the API 1 would have all the information about the Identity Server as well. Okay. So token response. Okay, so this is where we request the client credential token, and this is where we're passing this token endpoint, which we're grabbing from our discovery document. So we know where we're going to be sending our stuff, and in our token response, we get our information. We have our access token, we have the token type, all is good, right? This is pretty much the information that we're expecting. So by the time we get to our API, we just create the API. We get a handy extension method that, again, IdentityServer or IdentityModel package rather provides. We pass the access token, we get a response, and we get our content, which is a secret message from API 1, right? We pass that all back to the browser, and there it is, all that data, right? Okay, so wrapping up this episode, hopefully you understand that IdentityServer4 is just a set of packages that are abstraction for the specifications, and all it is that you have to learn what this toolbox sort of allows you to do. And in these tutorials, we're going to be going over learning about this toolbox that is IdentityServer4. And in this tutorial, we have actually covered the client credentials flow, and it is very useful for stuff like API communication, right? So if you have two APIs that might handle two different business areas, but they will still need to somehow communicate between each other, and they might need to call authorized endpoints, because they're sort of isolated, and the client ID and client secret will be secluded on that API. This is a safe option to use for authentication between two API, right? So the API is on your company network. It will request an access token from IdentityServer, and then it will be using it to access your APIs and whatnot, right? So remember, if you want to use client credentials flow, you want your client to be secured and not being publicly accessible. Right, so there shouldn't be an actual user using the client if you want to be using client credentials. All right, but this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. And as always, see you in my other episodes.